Let's begin on the module, the DBT skills module of emotion regulation. So let me say a bit about emotions first. As you know, the core construct in DBT, the understanding of the core problem is emotion dysregulation. Is that somebody, the relationship to emotions is troubled in that once an emotion is activated, that it's not effectively managed, and that includes many steps. So the idea of this module, of all four modules, is the one that it most purely addresses the problem of emotion regulation by teaching how to regulate emotions. Now, that's different than distress tolerance, which is also about emotions and regulating emotions, but it's about what to do when your emotions are very high in levels of distress and you're tempted to do something that you might regret or that's going down the wrong path. It's how to hang on and survive that emotion somehow so that you don't make things worse. And there's reality acceptance as part of that. So this is different in that you're directly addressing what is an emotion, what do we call emotions, how do they work, what's the model of emotions, what's the point of emotions, how do we relate differently to emotions. And essentially, one way to state the difference between this module and that other emotion-related module is that it's the module for learning to establish a new relationship with your emotions so that you can live with them, you can tame them, you can allow them as needed. You can, be a roommate with your emotions. Let them come, let them go, let them get intense, let them get less intense, without being in danger of having that cause you to do things that you would regret. Maybe a couple preliminary comments other than that. There's a lot of emotions, and there's controversy in the field of emotions and emotion regulation. But in this model, Linehan has now in this particular module named, I think, 10 emotions to work with, but there are others as well. A lot of emotion researchers will settle in on 7 or 8 or even 9 primary emotions, which are all included here, but there are others as well. And in some ways, the work that's been done around the emotion of fear and to some degree anxiety is extrapolated into addressing all of the emotions in each in their own way. So the other thing to say at the beginning is that as we understand emotions, they actually are brief reactions to a stimulus that involve many components. They involve thoughts, actions, urges, physiology, the brain. All these things happen almost instantaneously in concert once an emotion is triggered. And then there's an aftermath or an after effects of an emotion before another emotion comes. So usually emotions are thought to come and go unless you do something to keep them going within just 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 seconds, something like that. And when people experience emotions as staying and staying and staying, it's likely that either through their thinking or through actions, they are perpetuating those emotions. All right. Handout number 1 for this is goals of emotion regulation, right? And so ideally you've got your manual there with you, or you could have the PowerPoint slides that I've made. There's 4 big goals. One goal is to understand your emotions and name them. That in itself is a big deal for people whose emotions have been dysregulated and who've been invalidated in their lives. In a sense, they don't have a good compass. If a compass had different emotion at different points along the compass, you would know when you were at one emotion or another, but the person with emotion dysregulation might not know what emotion they're having or where it comes from, of course, or some of its characteristics and how it's different than other emotions. And so many people just blur them together and end up with one big mush of emotions. So one big goal is to understand and name your emotions. The second big goal is to decrease the frequency of the emotions that you don't want. So we're going to also get to decrease the intensity of those later, but decrease the frequency of emotions you don't want so that you've got more of the emotions you would want and less of the emotions that you don't want. The third is to decrease emotional vulnerability. In other words, the factors that lead you to be more vulnerable to having more intense or more frequent emotions than you want. So this kind of looks at a lot of physiological factors, environmental factors, and behavioral factors that make you more or less vulnerable. And finally, there's a goal of decreasing emotional suffering so that when you do have emotions that are already there, have been triggered, are intense maybe, that you suffer from them less. You have things to do to bring them down, to divert, and to manage extreme ones. Okay, next handout. Handout number 2. There's no star on this page, but I still recommend you take a look at this, that this is an overview of the first big goal, which is understanding and naming emotions. We're going to go over what emotions do for you. In other words, the function of emotions. Helps to know the function if you're thinking you could just get rid of them, or if you want to understand better how to work with them. Factors that make regulating emotions difficult. There are things that even if you know how to regulate emotions, you know some things about how to regulate them, there are certain factors that make them really difficult to regulate. If you can identify what those factors are, then you can approach those factors. Then we're going to go over a model for describing emotions, and that's an interesting and complicated model that sort of puts all on one page and one sort of flow chart the different components of an emotion. And finally, we're going to go over different ways to describe emotions that sort of are in sync with that model, so that with each emotion, you've got a way of filling in those blanks, you might say, filling in those blanks in the model of what are the different components. Let's say if you have anger, or if you have fear, or if you have love or joy. Next handout, what do emotions do for you? This is where you're starting to address what are the functions of emotions. And I'm going to introduce this to you in a simplified way, but I think it's useful to get it this way, is that emotions, and then you've got, as usual, much more in the manual to help you with teaching. But the idea is that emotions help to motivate for action. You know, if you are frightened, you might run, or you might call somebody, you might do something. And so it organizes you for action. If you're angry, you might organize for action to break through something, to stop something, to block something, to attack something. And if you're ashamed, you might be motivated to sort of back off a little and to get out of the public eye and hide out or not expose yourself. Second big function is that emotions communicate to other people and influence other people, and they are the most rapid-fire communication system that we've got. If you, for instance, were looking at me, but you could communicate with me, and I could see you while I'm talking to you, and you saw a bear come up behind me that I wasn't seeing, I would probably get my most important, really actionable information based on the way your face looked, how loud your voice was, and how intense you were, by telling me, that I should be afraid, so that the organisms in the world notice each other, react to each other quickly, their movements, smells, sounds, etc. And for us, emotions are a way to communicate with our tone, our face, our words, If I communicate an intense emotion, you will pick up that message more quickly. If I communicate fear, you're more likely to react quickly to something and look around, scan the environment for something to be afraid of, all which might happen quicker than if you explained it to me, in which case I might die and I'd never have my genes go on into the larger gene pool and I would be faded out. So the gene pools have selected for people that can stay alive, and being able to communicate emotions quickly, messages quickly, it can really help, and especially with body language and voice. And finally, emotions communicate to ourselves. In other words, there's information in emotions, so that if I'm talking to somebody and I notice myself becoming afraid, but I haven't seen anything that would frighten me or heard anything that would frighten me, my mind starts scanning for possible things to be afraid of, possible signals of danger, right? So my emotion communicates to me that there might be something going on, and then my brain picks it up, right? So and gut feelings, it mentions in this manual, are like intuition. You know, you get a feeling that tells you something, and then you might scan for that or move in that direction. So they motivate for action, they communicate, and they communicate to ourselves. The problem with communicating to ourselves is that sometimes we get false alarms. So we believe our emotion more than we believe the reality or the fact around us. So if I see somebody who sets off fear in me, it doesn't actually mean realistically that that person poses a danger to me. And so if I act as if that person poses a danger, it could start to become a problem. And then that has to be treated to try to help a person learn what actually is realistic about that. Okay, next, handout number 4. Just to introduce you to this one, what makes it hard to regulate emotions? This is 6 different factors that you might consider if you keep having trouble regulating your emotions. One is biology, biological factors, depression, things that trigger anger. There's all kinds of physiological input with hormones and autonomic nervous system, the brain that is going to make it harder to regulate emotions. It's just, we're biased that way genetically, and then we're biased environmentally. Once we are affected strongly by the environment, it gets built into our brains and our biology, and so it's harder to regulate emotions. With trauma, that's a good example of it, once you've been traumatized significantly and your biology has changed. Lack of skill. You've got emotions in you that are activated, but you grew up in an environment, for whatever reason, you don't have the skills. You don't know what to do that other people do, mostly invisibly, to regulate their emotions. So if you don't have the skills, that's going to be an important factor. And you can do something about that, such as take a DBT skills class. Next one, reinforcement of emotional behavior. Sometimes you'll find that a certain environment, a certain person in the environment actually reinforces you for having a certain emotion that you wish you could reduce. But actually it's reinforced. It's reinforced in that it works in the environment. Maybe your anger has worked too effectively. Maybe presenting yourself as frightened or anxious has elicited caretaking in such a way that anxiety and fear are reinforced. Shame might be reinforced. So any emotion can be reinforced by circumstances. And when you teach this, I recommend that you sort of think through 3 or 4 examples and get examples from the group. Moodiness, which is sort of a murky concept, but it's when you are in a certain mood, it can be hard to regulate your emotions. You may have, I'm not in a mood to restrain myself. I'm not in a mood to work very hard right now. So, you end up getting mood regulated.